Hi, my name is Alexander Hall, and this is my review of The Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. The Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself, is an autobiography written by Harriet Jacobs. And just to give a little bit of background, when she was a child, her mistress taught her how to read and write, which, those were skills that were extremely rare among slaves. At the age of 12, she fell into the hands of an abusive owner who harassed her sexually. When he threatened to sell her children, she hid in a tiny crawl space under the roof of her grandmother's house, also known as the garret, which we will later find out in the story. And after staying there for 7 years, spending much of her time reading the Bible and newspapers, she finally managed to escape to New York in 1842. In 1861, Jacobs published her manuscript of the incidents of the life of a slave girl, even though many works by many anti-slave activists, abolitionists, and African-American writers were already in print. So the context around which this book was written were pretty much the struggles and sexual abuses that female slaves often faced, as well as their efforts to, practice their motherhood and protecting their children, even though there was a great possibility that their children might be sold and they would be separated from their mothers and their families forever. Some major historical events that were happening at the time before the Civil War, and this is, again, when Jacobs was experiencing much of what she was gonna write in her narrative, were the Louisiana Rebellion of 1811, Nat Turner's Rebellion of 1831, and Bleeding Kansas. However, the circumstances in which the author produced, the text was that there was not really a piece or any piece of anti-slavery literature that specifically covered the struggles that, most African American women endure as slaves. For example, William Lloyd Garrison, a prominent abolitionist and anti-slave activist, had started a newspaper publication called The Liberator in 1831, and Frederick Douglass had published the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And although these two gentlemen have produced narratives that represent the culmination of slavery in the United States, none really have had the perspective of a woman, so that's what they really lack that Jacobs has been able to put forth to the public to give that unique perspective of a woman. And so again, none have had the perspective of a woman who had endured slavery, a perspective that could be useful in the understanding the different struggles between men and women, African American men and African American women who were slaves during the antebellum period in the United States. So the overall storyline of the book, documents Jacob's life as a slave and how she gained freedom for herself and for her children. Some general information that was provided in the book were contributions to the genre of the slave narrative by using the techniques of sentimental novels to address race and gender issues. And Jacobs explores these struggles and sexual abuses that female slaves often, faced and encountered, as well as their efforts to practice their motherhood and protect their children. Again, oftentimes these mothers would be ripped away from their children, both physically and figuratively, because they would, often be sold to different families. So that was really a big theme throughout this narrative. So, what are some of the book's highlights or most interesting or touching passages? This book does an extraordinary job of highlighting some of the cruel content which Jacobs was exposed to during her life. For example, in chapter 14, titled Another Life to Thank, page 117, Jacobs describes how she had not returned to her master's house since the birth of her child, a child, which she bore for her master, Dr. Flint. And Jacobs continues further to explain how Dr. Flint's wife threatened to kill her if she came back to her master's house, which is, a pretty bold claim, to say the least. Not only does Jacobs highlight this specific experience she had between her master and her master's wife, but I think that her experiences represent a lot of African American women's struggles, in that many women, much like Jacobs, probably experience very similar situations where they get sexually abused or sexually harassed by their masters, and then these women end up having children with them. Also, this form of abuse, I think, plays into the bigger narrative of the race issue, and how, as a result of slave owners having offspring with slaves, mixed races start to prevail. In addition, a central pattern in incidents in the life of a slave girl is the idea that, white women sometimes cross the boundary of allegiances of race and class to go out of their way and help young slave women. For example, later on in the narrative, when Jacobs is threatened to be recaptured in New York by Emily Flint and her husband, Mr. Dodge, a white woman who is herself a slaveholder, takes her in and hides her in her house for a month. And, I feel like that's very, that really shows how, in some cases, women, cross the boundaries to defend, their fellow women, not minding the color of their skin, because, again, they can also relate a little bit, because women at this time, even white women, did not hold the same social status that men did. So I feel like that they can relate to these young African slave women, running away a little bit more than a white man would. So in that sense, I feel like that's a valid idea in the narrative. Now, some of the text shortcomings, and in my opinion, I don't really think it's considered a shortcoming, is that the space of Jacobs, where she was hiding in for 7 years, the place called the garret that I mentioned earlier, has been used as a metaphor in the context of, black struggle and invasion. And although it is not really meant in a negative way, I just thought it was really interesting how Jacob's experiences were so influential to many people that they sometimes are used as metaphors.